In this video we want to talk about health and safety issues. Now this will be mostly from a UK perspective. However, there are general principles in here that should be understood in the context of all working situations. So it's an important class because it does contain some general comments about health and safety, as well as relating it to some specific issues associated with the UK. So first of all, organisations have a legal duty to protect their employees from workplace accidents and hazards. So it's a legal requirement. HR and line managers must be aware of employee safety and must provide appropriate training to safeguard them. People don't go to work to get hurt or to get injured. They go to work to earn a living. And it's only right that the employer should take every step imaginable to secure the safety of his or her employees. So the workplace should be free from the potentials for hazards and accidents. Management should make strenuous efforts to try and clear issues that can cause hazards and accidents and cause injury to the workforce. So there should be a continuous review of safety matters within the organisation. The employees must feel safe within their work environment in order for them to work to targets and increase productivity. If they are distracted by hazards or worries about their own safety, they will not focus on what they're meant to do. So this is over and above any ethical position that the organisation should have in relationship to the safety of its employees, or indeed over and above any consideration the organisation should have with respect to the legal obligations it has to protect its employees. So there may be a positive comeback from having health and safety issues to the fore within organisations in the form of increased productivity. It could be the case that workers will work harder, feel loyal to the organisation, have more motivation, feel more relaxed about their position within the company if they're not worried about injury or hazard or pollution or noise. If it sees management taking these issues seriously, then the workforce may be more loyal and dedicated to the organisation. The legal framework, well, in the UK it operates under several health and safety legislations. It's important for organisations to follow legal procedures in order to safeguard employees. The purpose of implementing legislation is to ensure hazards and risks are kept to a minimum. We would like to think that people will do this without legislation. We would like to think that companies will keep their organisations safe and secure. Unfortunately, there have been many accidents and many issues, not just in the UK but throughout the world, which suggests that employers may want to cut corners and make savings, and in so doing jeopardise the lives of the employees or risk injury or long-term damage to the lives of the employees. So for this reason there is a legal underpinning that requires organisations to behave in certain ways. As I said, we would like to think that this would happen without the legislation. Unfortunately, because of so many accidents in the past years and so many issues in the past years in many countries throughout the world, it suggests that employers will not universally adopt principles and ways of working which are hazard free, or at least minimise the hazards and the risks to the labour force. There are legal obligations if an organisation fails to meet legislative requirements. In some cases it could be criminal prosecution, where if the danger is seen as sufficiently severe, then the employer may face criminal prosecution. But there is a legal framework, and that's the point. Now, the workplace hazards, well, line managers must be able to recognise workplace hazards and implement procedures to ensure they do not cause harm. So the line managers should be trained to spot hazards and to spot issues, and perhaps anticipate injury and anticipate issues before they happen. So line managers should be appropriately trained. There are two types of workplace hazards that we can identify: psychological and physical. Psychological is associated with factors such as stress and related to bullying and harassment, loss, grief, trauma, and mental health. The workplace can be a stressful organisation. It can be a stressful place for the employees, and because of that it may build up and cause psychological issues, stress and worry, and it could lead to long-term mental damage. It's important to recognise this and for the organisation to take steps to ameliorate this problem. Now, the physical can be characterised into different categories. For example, specific and also general. So the general, for a start, general hazards that apply to workplace environments, for example, wet floors. They have a signpost. Normally the organisation puts a signpost to say that the surface is slippery, and to advise personnel that it is dangerous. They may slip and hurt themselves. There could be warnings regarding electrical faults. There could be trailing wires, perhaps electric wires, which may cause a problem. Or using some machinery may require extra safety clothing and protection. The more specific, some work environments will present additional working hazards over and above the general ones. So it could be, for example, working with toxic chemicals or dangerous machinery, or perhaps loading or unloading heavy materials. So in addition to the general one, which applies to all organizations, there are specific that apply to particular organizations. The following are some workplace hazards. Workplace environment. Well, space, lighting, temperature, ventilation, electrical safety, waste disposal, and warning signposts. In other words, there can be a whole variety of hazards. The lighting may be inappropriate. It may damage people's eyes working under dimly lit conditions. The temperature may not be appropriate. The temperature may be outside of what is tolerable for long-term exposure. The ventilation may not be good. The quality of the air in the building may not be good because it's not properly ventilated, and so on. These are workplace environment hazards. There may be a requirement for protective equipment, for example, rail guards, the use of helmets on building sites, for example, protective clothing if they're working with chemicals or with particular substances that require protective clothing. It could be that vehicle and machinery safety needs to be looked at and maintained on a regular basis to ensure its safety. And also, of course, there's health and hygiene facilities. There has to be appropriate toilet facilities and washing facilities. If there's a canteen in the workplace, the food hygiene has to be maintained to a good standard. And there has to be first aid and first aid training for personnel. Not just first aid equipment, but appropriate training, and there should be information for all the workforce to know where first aid facilities are available. And also looking at infection control to make sure that infections within the workplace are controlled. For example, if someone turns up to work with influenza or a bad cold, they may work perhaps in a different area, perhaps isolated from the other workers so they don't pass it on, or preferably be asked to return home and look after themselves. The following are some workplace hazards. Well, fire. Fire is a never-present problem in organisations, and there have been many examples of workplace fires that have been disastrous for the working population. So there should be every effort taken to prevent fires and to fireproof the working environment. So there should be extinguishers and fire blankets throughout the building. There should be good alarm systems and evacuation procedures and training on fire prevention. In the event of a fire, the workforce should know how to escape from the building, how to get out safely. Well-being, well, protection from bullying and violence at work. People don't go to work to be bullied by their colleagues or by management and not have the threat of violence. They go to work to earn a living, to support themselves or support their families. They don't go to work to be abused. There should also be some effort to look at the workload that's placed on the workers to make sure that it's not inordinate, that it's a reasonable amount, and that the person is not brought under stress to try and complete large amounts of work which is not reasonable. There should be some facility to try to resolve conflict when it arises, conflict between workers or between workers and management. There should be some way of reconciling it and resolving the issue. And there should also be recognition of equality and diversity, that in many societies the workforce will be made up from different types of people, from different backgrounds, different cultures, different religions, different languages, and there should be a policy and a way of managing that diversity. Under the legal framework, it's essential that organisations produce risk assessment documentations. It's important that organisations know what the risks are and take steps to show that they have got policies and procedures in place to deal with risks of fire, risks of damage, risks to health, and so on. So there should be risk assessment exercises, and documentation should be kept, and should be kept up to date to show how management will deal with particular events should they occur. Risk assessment documentation identifies potential workplace hazards or hazards due to change in the work environment. So hazards should be anticipated and should be looked at. Risks should be assigned as to even what are the probabilities of these happening and what steps should be put in place should it arise. For example, a risk assessment should be carried out during a relocation or a school trip or new machinery or organising meetings and conferences. What are the risks? What could go wrong? What could happen? And make sure that all who attend that place, whether it be a workplace or a school trip or a small section in a company where a new machinery has been introduced, whatever it is, they should be briefed on what to do in the event of a problem arising. A risk assessment must take into account all employees, not just a group. For example, the pregnant and elderly workers. Risk assessment should not just be confined to particular groups, like, for example, elderly workers or whatever. It should take into account all employees because the risk applies to all, perhaps. Particular mention could be made of these particular subgroups but essentially all who are likely to be affected should be included in the risk assessment. And the purpose of risk assessment is to identify potential hazards and implement procedures to avoid or respond to accidents. So if a situation arises, if an adverse situation arises, small fire or whatever, then what are the procedures that should be followed? And making sure that there are personnel who have been trained to deal with that situation and who have the resources to deal with it are in place. All risks must be identified and dealt with according to the nature and level of the harm. Clearly, if it's a small fire, perhaps it could be localized, and some skilled personnel who've been trained in fire prevention using extinguishers and blankets and so on could deal with the situation. But if it's a large outbreak, then it is dangerous for any staff to confront that situation, and it needs expert attention from fire brigades and from the outside authorities. The priority of the management in that case is to safely evacuate all members of staff, all employees, and make sure that they have been briefed in advance as to evacuation procedures. They know how to leave the building in an orderly fashion. They know the safe routes and the assembly points where they can meet and be checked. Risk assessment should be on an ongoing activity and an important part of risk management. So risk assessment is not a one-off exercise. It's something that should be done on a regular basis, and it should be integrated into the works calendar. That risk assessment should be carried out on a frequent basis, every month perhaps, or every 2 months, or whatever is appropriate. Organisations should continuously monitor and have a reassessment of potential workplace hazards. It's important that the organisation know what the hazards are and anticipate hazards arising in the future, and have contingency plans in place to deal with those hazards. So it's continuously monitoring and assessing and reassessing potential hazards. A risk management ensures that risks are kept to a minimum and always kept on the agenda. It's important that the management know what the risks are. And if there's an area of high risk of accident or hazard, then that should be the subject of more frequent scrutiny and assessment, and there should be more training for the personnel within that section. In addition, all the resources necessary to prevent hazard and damage to individuals or risks to life, or the equipment and the resources needed should be in place, and there should be adequate training on the use of those resources. The aim of risk management is to devise policies which provide a framework for employees and managers to follow health and safety procedures and practices. So risk management enables the management to understand all of the risks and hazards within the organisation, to know the likely severity of each of them, and concentrate its resources in a way that minimises risk to life or damage to health, or minimises adversely. It minimises the adverse effects, I should say, of something going wrong on the well-being of the labour force. It should enable the labour force to go to work feeling confident that they are not going to be hurt whilst working. Risk management must ensure that appropriate monitoring and recording of accidents and illnesses and hazards takes place. It's important that all accidents and illnesses and hazards are recorded, so that there's a full understanding of the likely risks within the organisation, and that there are policies and procedures in place to deal with those and to minimise the adverse effects on the working population within that section, to minimise the effects on the employees within the section. Effective management of risks ensures that staff and management feel safe within their work environment, and that can have a payback to the organisation, as I said earlier, in the form of higher productivity and greater concentration on quality and on output, and a better atmosphere in which to work, more confidence in the organisation, more loyalty, more motivation. The risks should be minimised, and the employees should understand that the management are doing everything possible to try and minimise the risks. There should be adequate resourcing, protective clothing, fire extinguishers, fire blankets, adequate training for the staff. There should be full knowledge of escape routes in the event of something adverse happening, assembly points where everyone can be checked off, key personnel identified for the position of health and safety inspectors, good documentation kept regarding illnesses and injuries in the past, and a good audit of the likely hazards and risks that are inherent in the workplace, that are in place in the workplace, and perhaps can't easily be removed, but at least good training, good resourcing can minimise the severe impacts that these could have on the employees. So, health and safety is an issue that the HR department should take seriously and should factor in to its overall duties in terms of its management of its personnel and the health and safety of the personnel. That's all I'm going to deal with in this session, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.